I still work at the Ashcroft building, though I do not go into the basement anymore. I have rearranged my maintenance schedule so that another contractor handles the furnace inspections and the water system checks. I have paid out of my own pocket for these services for the past 18 months, and I do not care if it affects my salary or my job security. There are places within that building that I will not enter, not because I am afraid, but because I understand now what the previous caretaker understood, and understanding it means you cannot pretend you do not know. This starts with a letter I found in the maintenance office on my first day working at the Ashcroft building in Portland, Oregon, dated 3 weeks prior to my arrival, signed by someone named Richard Halford. Richard was the caretaker before me. He had left the building, left the job, and apparently left very quickly, because the only thing he took with him was his keys and his clothes. Everything else, his tools, his personal items, the small coffee maker he kept in the office, remained as though he had simply decided one day that he could not return. The letter contained 8 rules. There were no explanations, no context, no indication of why these rules mattered, or what would happen if they were violated. Just 8 numbered points written in what looked like careful, deliberate handwriting, each one more specific and stranger than the last. If you spend your work life in environments where things are not quite right, subscribe to this channel and share this with someone who has felt the same unease in a particular location. Like this video if you think some warnings should be taken seriously even when they make no sense. I need people to understand that rules without explanation are the most important rules of all. My name is Marcus Webb, and I have been a caretaker and facilities manager for most of my adult life. I started at 23, working for a property management company in Seattle, and I spent 12 years maintaining various office buildings and residential complexes before I took the position at the Ashcroft building in Portland. I am good at my job. I understand building systems, plumbing, electrical infrastructure, HVAC operations, safety codes, and tenant relations. I have dealt with emergencies ranging from burst pipes to electrical fires to medical situations requiring police response. I am not a person who is easily disturbed by unusual circumstances, but I am someone who respects written warnings, and Richard's letter disturbed me profoundly. The letter read as follows. Mark, sorry, your name is probably not Mark. I am writing this to whoever takes this job after me because I cannot stay and I cannot adequately explain why. What I can do is give you the rules, follow them exactly. Do not deviate, do not rationalize, do not assume they are mistakes or outdated or that times have changed. The Ashcroft building requires these rules to function safely. I do not know the full reason, but I know that when they have been followed, nothing happens. When they have been broken, something happens. Read the rules every day, commit them to memory, do not tell anyone they exist. And if you ever break one, implement the contingency immediately. These are the rules. 1. Do not enter the eastern stairwell after 6 p.m. or before 6 a.m. The stairwell is locked. It must remain locked. If you find it unlocked, lock it immediately and fill the building maintenance log with a false entry stating that you found it locked but check the mechanisms. 2. If you hear movement in the walls, report it to the property management office as building settling or minor animal activity. Do not mention it to tenants. Do not investigate. Do not enter the wall spaces for any reason other than scheduled electrical maintenance, and if you do enter, you must leave the access panel open for at least 4 hours afterward. 3. Never perform maintenance work alone in the basement. This is non-negotiable. Even if it seems like a simple task requiring 5 minutes, you must call a contractor or another staff member to be present while you are in the basement. If you cannot get someone to come, wait until you can. 4. The water temperature in the northwestern bathroom on the 7th floor has no connection to the building's hot water system. Do not attempt to repair it. If tenants complain, have them call property management. Do not investigate the source of heat in that bathroom. 5. If the power fails, restore it immediately. Do not wait. Do not go home. The building requires electrical power continuously. I do not know what the consequence of extended power loss is, and I do not want to know. 6. There is a locked door in the south basement that does not appear on any building blueprint or permit documentation. You will never need to go through that door. If it becomes unlocked, lock it immediately from the outside and call property management. Under no circumstances should you allow it to remain unlocked or open. Daffordif. 7. Respond to all tenant complaints about plumbing issues within 4 hours. Do not delay. If a tenant reports water flow problems or unusual sounds in the pipes, this takes priority over all other maintenance work. Respond immediately if possible. 8. If you ever find yourself thinking that you should break one of these rules, or if you ever feel compelled to violate them, implement the contingency. Lock the building, call property management, and do not return until you have spoken with them directly. Do not go into the field. Do not investigate. Come get me if you can and we will leave together. I am leaving after 2 years in this position. I did not plan to leave. But I cannot continue to follow these rules without knowing what they are protecting against, and I do not want to know badly enough to break them to find out. I hope whoever reads this takes it seriously. Richard. I read this letter 3 times on my first day at the Ashcroft building. I read it while sitting in the maintenance office, which was a small room in the basement filled with filing cabinets, a cluttered desk, a calendar from 1987 that had never been updated, and the distinctive smell of cement, old copper pipes and dust. After reading it the 3rd time, I folded the letter carefully and put it in my pocket. I decided that I would follow the rules, and I did not want to think too hard about why they had been written. The Ashcroft building itself is a mid-rise structure built in 1952, with 8 floors of residential apartments, each floor typically containing 6 to 8 units depending on the original floor plan. The building has 48 apartments total. The property management company that hired me, Cascade Properties, had described the Ashcroft as a reliable income property with stable long-term tenants and no significant maintenance issues. They did not mention anything unusual about the building's history or operations. They also did not mention that the previous caretaker had left under unspecified circumstances. I learned about Richard's departure by asking the property manager, a woman named Susan Chen who worked out of the downtown Cascade Properties office. She told me that Richard had given 2 weeks' notice, which was professional, but that he had seemed increasingly distressed during that final 2 weeks. She said that he had mentioned personal circumstances requiring him to leave Portland, and that he had left no forwarding contact information. When I asked if there had been any specific incidents or problems at the building that might have contributed to his departure, Susan said that as far as she knew, everything had been normal. She seemed slightly uncomfortable with the question, and she moved on to discussing my compensation package. I moved to Portland to take this job. I rented a small apartment in northeast Portland, about 20 minutes from the Ashcroft building. I was excited about the position because the Ashcroft was a well-maintained property with a reputation for stability, and because the job offered on-site living quarters if I wanted them. A small 1-bedroom apartment on the 1st floor that was included as part of my compensation. I chose not to live in the building, deciding that I would maintain a separation between my workspace and my personal space. This decision probably saved my sanity, though I did not understand that at the time. My first week working at the Ashcroft was completely normal. I met with Susan to review the building systems and the tenant roster. I toured the building from the roof to the basement. I met several tenants who were friendly and welcoming. I reviewed the maintenance logs from Richard's tenure, which showed routine work, plumbing repairs, HVAC filter changes, light bulb replacements, weather-related preventive maintenance. The logs showed nothing unusual, and yet as I became familiar with the building, I began to notice small details that contradicted Richard's letter, or that seemed to suggest he had been serious about the rules. The eastern stairwell, for instance, was equipped with an electronic lock that required a keycard to operate. I had a keycard that allowed me to access all locked areas of the building, including the eastern stairwell. But when I attempted to use the keycard on the eastern stairwell door at 6 p.m. on my second day, I found that the lock was not accepting my card. The electronic locking mechanism appeared to be malfunctioning. I called the company that maintained the electronic locks, and they sent a technician to evaluate the problem. The technician was puzzled because the lock appeared to be functioning correctly. The mechanism responded to his card without issue. He set the lock to accept my card, made some adjustments to the timing, and assured me that the problem was resolved. But when I returned to the eastern stairwell door at 6 p.m. the following day, the lock rejected my card again. I contacted Cascade Properties and reported the lock malfunction. Susan told me that she would put in a work order with the electronic lock company. I did not mention that the lock seemed to malfunction specifically after 6 p.m. I did not mention Richard's rule about the eastern stairwell. I simply reported a technical problem and waited for it to be resolved. But I began using a different stairwell for my basement access after 6 p.m., and I began paying attention to the eastern stairwell to see if anyone else was using it during the evening hours. I never saw anyone enter or exit. The door appeared to remain locked. The second detail I noticed involved plumbing in the 7th floor. I had been making a list of deferred maintenance items and tenant-reported issues when I found a note in the tenant communication log from Richard, dated about 6 months into his tenure. The note mentioned that a tenant in 7G had reported unusually hot water in the northwestern bathroom. Richard had noted that he had informed the tenant this was a known condition and had encouraged them to call property management for any concerns. He had written that he had not performed any investigation into the issue. This detail struck me because it exactly matched Richard's rule number 4, something about the water in the northwestern bathroom on the 7th floor having no connection to the building's hot water system. I decided, somewhat to my own surprise, that I would not investigate the source of the heat in that bathroom. I would follow Richard's rule as stated. During my third week, a tenant on the 4th floor, a woman named Linda Chen, no relation to Susan the property manager, called to report that she was hearing sounds in her walls. She described it as a kind of movement, a subtle scratching or shifting sound, especially noticeable late at night. This was the kind of call that a caretaker typically handles by either checking for rodent activity or investigating how pipes in the walls might be causing noise due to water pressure changes or temperature expansion. I went to Linda's apartment to listen to the noise. I stood in her bedroom for about 10 minutes with the lights off and the apartment quiet, and I did hear something, not a loud sound, but a subtle, almost rhythmic shifting that seemed to come from within the walls. Richard's Rule 2 stated that if I heard movement in the walls, I should report it as building settling or minor animal activity, and I should not investigate. I should not tell tenants anything more than that. I should not enter the wall spaces for any reason other than scheduled electrical maintenance, and if I did, I must leave the access panel open for at least 4 hours. So I told Linda Chen that the sound was most likely the building settling, which was common in older structures, or possibly minor animal activity in the walls, though I had no indication of infestation. I told her that I would monitor the situation and would let her know if I discovered anything concerning. I did not enter her walls. I did not investigate further. I reported the incident to Cascade Properties as suspected minor animal activity, no evidence of infestation, situation being monitored. What I did not do, what I was very careful not to do, was call an exterminator, or recommend that she call an exterminator. And I listened very carefully to the sounds I heard, trying to determine whether they matched anything in my experience with buildings and building systems. They did not. By the end of my first month, I had begun to accept, without fully understanding why, that I would follow Richard's rules exactly as written. I had made copies of his letter and placed one in the maintenance log binder, one in my apartment and one in a waterproof container that I kept in my car. I had committed the rules to memory, and I had begun to notice that following them seemed to prevent certain things from happening, or at least nothing bad had happened as long as I was following them. In my second month I experienced something that moved me from skepticism to something closer to belief. A tenant on the 6th floor, a man named David Hutchins, called to report that his toilet was not draining properly. This is routine maintenance work. A clogged toilet can usually be resolved with a plunger, a plumbing snake, or in severe cases, by removing the toilet completely and clearing the blockage at the base. But Rule 7 specifically stated that I should respond to all tenant complaints about plumbing issues within 4 hours, and that I should prioritize them above all other work. This seemed like an unusual emphasis, but I decided to follow it literally. I went to David's apartment within 2 hours of receiving his call. I attempted to clear the clog using standard methods, plunger, snake, and then by examining the base of the toilet. I could not locate a blockage. The water drained from the tank normally, but something was preventing it from flowing through the toilet itself. I removed the toilet completely, which required turning off the water supply to the unit and disconnecting the sewer connection. With the toilet removed, I could see into the waistline. It was clear. There was no blockage. I remounted the toilet, and I found that it drained normally with no issues whatsoever. When I returned to the apartment 2 days later to follow up with David and ensure the problem had not returned, he reported that the toilet had worked perfectly since I had cleared it. He was puzzled because he had tested it after I left, and it had been working fine then. He asked me what the problem had been. I told him that there had been a slight buildup that had resolved itself, and that if the problem returned he should call me immediately. What I thought, but did not say, was that there had been nothing wrong with the toilet, and that something had been preventing it from functioning properly, and that something had stopped preventing it once I had taken the system apart. I later read in the maintenance logs that Richard had resolved a similar call about a plumbing issue in late fall of his tenure, and that the resolution had been immediate and without any identified cause. He had written simply, "Cleared blockage, system restored." By November of my first year at the Ashcroft building, I had been following Richard's rules for 9 months without breaking a single one. I had been meticulous about implementing each rule, and I had been vigilant about preventing any violations. And in those 9 months nothing bad had happened in the building. No structural failures, no water damage, no electrical problems, no tenant emergencies of any kind. But I had also begun to feel trapped. The rules, I realized, were not just safety protocols. They were constraints that governed my work and my ability to function in the building. The eastern stairwell was off limits after 6 p.m., which meant I could not use the most efficient route for basement access in the evening. The rule about not entering the walls meant that I had limited options for addressing maintenance issues in certain units. The rule about responding to plumbing calls within 4 hours meant that I often had to drop other work and respond to emergencies that turned out not to be emergencies at all. And the rule about the water in the 7th floor bathroom, the rule about maintaining power at all costs, the rule about the locked door in the south basement. These rules implied that something was very wrong with the Ashcroft building, something that Richard had not been willing to explain but had deemed necessary to manage. I wanted to know what I was managing. I wanted to understand what I was preventing from happening by following these seemingly arbitrary rules. I decided, after much deliberation, that I would investigate one of the rules. Not to break it, but to understand it. I would choose a rule that seemed least dangerous to test, and I would implement Richard's contingency afterward. Lock the building, call property management, and do not return until I had spoken with them directly. I had found this door during my first week at the Ashcroft building. It was located in a storage area that was accessible from the main basement room. The door was small, about the size of a standard doorway, but it was constructed of heavy steel and equipped with a deadbolt lock that appeared to have never been used. The door did not appear on any of the building blueprints that I had reviewed. It was not marked with any identifier or warning sign. If I had not been looking for something unusual during my building tour, I might never have noticed it at all. The door appeared to lead to a space that was not part of the building's original layout. Based on the dimensions and the position, I estimated that the space behind the door might be another basement level, a sub-basement or lower level that was not accessible through any other entrance and that was not documented in the building's blueprints or permit records. Richard's rule was clear. If the door became unlocked, lock it immediately from the outside and call property management. Under no circumstances should I allow it to remain unlocked or open. The implication was that the door might become unlocked, and that this would be a serious problem. On a Tuesday evening in late November, I went to the basement during my normal inspection rounds. I was alone in the building, all tenants were in their units, and there were no contractors or maintenance personnel present. I had arranged this deliberately, ensuring that I would be alone when I attempted to examine the door more closely. I approached the locked door and examined the lock. It was a commercial-grade deadbolt, the kind you might see on a security door or a hazmat container. There were no signs of tampering or age. There were no warning labels or instructional stickers. The door appeared to be in perfect condition. I placed my hand on the door and pushed. It was solid and unmovable. I then did something that I knew was a violation of protocol. I examined the lock more closely. I looked for wear patterns, scratches from a key, any indication that the lock had been opened recently. I found none. I stood there for several minutes, looking at the door, and I felt something that I can only describe as dread. It was not fear exactly, and it was not rational apprehension. It was a kind of deep physical certainty that this door should remain locked, that nothing good could come from opening it, and that the longer I stood there examining it, the more I was violating something fundamental about the building's structure. I did not attempt to pick the lock. I did not attempt to force the door. I did not attempt to look through any cracks to see what might be on the other side. I simply stood there for a moment, and then I walked away. I implemented Richard's contingency. I locked the building, verifying that all doors and windows were secured. I called Cascade Properties and requested an emergency meeting with management. I told them that I had identified a structural concern that required discussion, and that I would not return to the building until we had spoken. Susan Chen, the property manager, seemed surprised and concerned by my call. She asked if there was an immediate danger to tenants. I told her that I did not believe so, but that I had questions about the building's construction and layout that I needed answered before I could continue performing my duties. We met the following morning in Susan's office in downtown Portland, and that meeting, I think, was when I truly began to understand what I was dealing with. Susan brought with her a folder of documents related to the Ashcroft building. Inside the folder were architectural blueprints, building permits, inspection records, and other documentation. She laid these out on the conference table and said very carefully that she understood I had questions about the building. I asked her about the locked door in the south basement. I asked her why it was not on any of the blueprints. I asked her what was behind it. Susan was quiet for a long moment. Then she said that she could not answer those questions and that she was not supposed to discuss them with building caretakers. But she also said that she would allow me to read Richard's letter, if I had it, or she would provide me with a different letter. A letter from the Ashcroft building's original property manager from 1952, a letter that had been passed along to every caretaker and every property manager for the past 70 years. She pulled out a sealed envelope from her folder. The envelope was yellowed with age and marked for property management and caretaker personnel only. She explained that this letter contained the history and the truth about the building, and that she would allow me to read it. But she warned me that reading it would change how I understood my job and my relationship to the Ashcroft building. I asked her if she had read the letter. She said yes, and that she had requested a transfer to another property management company when she was appointed to oversee the Ashcroft, but that the transfer had been denied. She said that people who worked at Cascade Properties and managed or maintained the Ashcroft building did not get to leave the position. I opened the envelope and read the letter from 1952. The letter explained that the Ashcroft building had been constructed in 1952 on a site that had previously been occupied by a different structure, a boarding house that had burned down in 1947. The fire at the boarding house had been suspicious. There had been a high death toll, well over 50 people, and the fire had originated in the basement in a section that had been sealed off and inaccessible to residents. The fire had occurred after the property manager had reported hearing unusual sounds in the sealed basement section and had locked that area to prevent tenants from entering it. The boarding house was destroyed completely, and the site remained vacant for 5 years. When the Ashcroft building was constructed, the builders had discovered something during the foundation work. They had discovered that beneath the site, at a depth of approximately 25 feet, was a large hollow space, a void or chamber of unknown origin. This chamber was roughly circular, about 30 feet in diameter, and its walls showed no signs of natural formation. They were too smooth, too regular, and there were markings on the walls that appeared to be intentional but were not in any language that could be identified. The original contractors had recommended filling the chamber with concrete and building over it. But during the excavation phase, workers had begun reporting strange occurrences, equipment failures, workers becoming ill or disoriented, and sounds emanating from the chamber that had no clear source. 3 workers had died during construction, one from an equipment failure that should not have been possible, one from sudden illness that doctors could not diagnose, and one from injuries sustained in a fall in the basement, though he had been on level ground when it occurred. The construction company had threatened to abandon the project unless the building owner agreed to implement specific protocols. The owner, after consulting with religious specialists, architects, engineers, and security experts, had agreed to build the Ashcroft building with a sealed basement level and a series of rules designed to prevent any unauthorized access to or disruption of the chamber below. The 8 rules I had been following were a modified, updated version of the original protocols. They had been refined over 70 years based on what caretakers and property managers had learned about managing the building safely. The locked door in the south basement was the entrance to the chamber, or at least an entrance that led to a shaft that descended to the chamber level. The rules existed to prevent someone from accessing that chamber, or from disrupting the seals that kept the chamber isolated from the occupied space above. When this seal was violated, bad things happened, not always immediately, but eventually. Structural damage, equipment failures, tenant health problems, and eventually catastrophic events. The boarding house fire had occurred when the sealed basement section had been breached and the seal compromised. Over 70 years there had been periodic incidents at the Ashcroft building related to violations of the protocols. A fire in 1968 that started in the basement with no clear cause. A gas leak in 1985 that sickened 3 tenants. A structural collapse in the basement in 1997 that killed a contractor who had attempted to repair the foundation without following protocol. Each incident had been handled quietly, investigated by internal security personnel, and officially explained away. Cascade Properties kept records, but these records were not made public and were not disclosed to standard regulatory bodies. I finished reading the letter and I looked up at Susan. I asked her what was in the chamber. She said she did not know, and that she did not want to know. She said that the Ashcroft building was being managed, not because anyone understood the chamber or had a desire to use it, but because the protocols were the best understood method of keeping it sealed and keeping everyone above it safe. She said that if I broke the protocols, I would potentially compromise that safety, and that I would be responsible for whatever consequences followed. I asked her how long this had been going on. She said that she did not know. The letter from 1952 suggested that the chamber had always been there, possibly predating the original boarding house, possibly predating European settlement in Portland. It might have been created by natural geological processes, or it might have been created by something else. The letter did not speculate on that. I asked her why Richard had left. Susan said that Richard had not been told about the chamber, about the letter, or about the true purpose of the rules. He had simply been given the rules and told to follow them. She said that she suspected he had broken one of the rules and had experienced consequences that had frightened him enough to leave Portland entirely. I asked her what kinds of consequences. She said that she could not tell me, that would constitute knowledge that might influence my own decisions and judgment, and that everyone who worked at the Ashcroft building needed to make their choices based on their own understanding and their own will. I then asked the most important question. Did I have a choice about whether to continue working at the Ashcroft building? Susan was quiet for a very long time. Then she said that I had a choice to stay or to leave. But she also said that people who left Cascade Properties after working at the Ashcroft building did not typically go far. They often remained in Portland. They often found reasons to return to the building. They often experienced the kinds of consequences that Richard had experienced. She said that the building had a way of keeping people involved with it, and that the most secure option in her judgment was to stay and follow the protocols, because at least then you had rules that you understood and that you could follow. I left the property management office in a state of profound disturbance. I did not return to the Ashcroft building for 4 days. I took personal time off, and I considered whether I should resign entirely. But Susan's implication that leaving would not actually free me from involvement with the building or the chamber stuck with me, and the simple fact remained that I had been following the protocols, and nothing bad had happened. In 9 months of carefully following 8 arbitrary rules, I had prevented any kind of catastrophic incident. Maybe, I thought, the only way to survive the Ashcroft building was to accept it, understand its constraints, and work within them. I returned to the building on a Friday morning, and I resumed my duties as caretaker. I did not mention the letter or the chamber to anyone. I did not share the information with Cascade Properties. I simply returned to my job, and I continued to follow the 8 rules. But my understanding of the building had fundamentally changed. I was no longer maintaining a building. I was maintaining a containment system. I was one part of a larger apparatus designed to keep something isolated, something unknown, something that had apparently existed long before the Ashcroft was built and would exist long after it was gone. And more troubling still, I began to understand that there were ways in which the building and the rules were not completely separable, ways in which following the rules created a kind of symbiosis between myself and the structure. The rules required my constant attention and management. The building in turn seemed to function more smoothly when I was paying attention. Over the following months I began to notice patterns that suggested the building was almost communicating with me through the maintenance issues and tenant complaints that arose. I mention this observation is because it became important later, and I did not understand it at the time. The plumbing I have not camped in the Sawtooth Wilderness in 5 years. And I will not go back. I have not returned to that area of Idaho at all, despite owning a 32-foot diesel pusher that is more than capable of handling the drive, and despite having spent the better part of 2 decades exploring remote camping locations across the American West. I still own maps of the region. I still receive emails about new campground developments in Stanley. And I still, without fail, immediately delete them without reading past the location name. There are places that become impossible after a certain experience, not because of logic or rational fear, but because something in your nervous system recognizes that you are not supposed to return to that place. That is what the Sawtooth Wilderness became for me. This started as what I thought would be a final trip before I had to sell the RV. My wife had terminal cancer. We had known for 18 months that she would not make it past late fall. In May, during what we understood would be her last healthy summer, we packed the RV with the intention of spending 3 weeks in the mountains, taking things slowly, stopping whenever something moved her, climbing to viewpoints when she felt strong enough, and simply being together in the places we had always loved. We were not afraid of dying. We were only afraid of running out of time before we did. If you spend any amount of time in RV communities, subscribe to this channel and share this with someone who camps regularly in isolated areas. Because what happened to us happened to other people too. And I need people to know about it. Like this video if you think warnings about remote locations should be taken more seriously than they are. The Sawtooth Wilderness in central Idaho is one of the most beautiful mountain regions in the continental United States. The mountains are granite, jagged, snow-capped even in late summer, rising to over 10,000 feet. The lakes are impossibly blue and cold. The trails are numerous and well maintained by the Forest Service, and the valley floors support a series of established campgrounds that range from completely undeveloped to having basic facilities like water and vault toilets. We had been going to the Sawtooth region for almost 20 years, and we knew it well. We had favorite campsites, favorite viewpoints, favorite small towns where we would park the RV for resupply. My name is Robert Patterson, and I have been RV camping consistently for 43 years. I worked as a construction project manager for 35 years before retiring at 62, and I bought my first small travel trailer the year I retired. Over the decades, my wife Margaret and I took progressively longer trips, upgrading to larger RVs as our means improved, exploring every major camping area west of the Mississippi River. I have extensive knowledge of RV systems, mechanical troubleshooting, navigation, weather, and wilderness safety. I have attended seminars on RV maintenance and camping safety. I hold a valid CDL for the diesel pusher we owned. I have recovered from a blown transmission in the middle of the Utah desert. I have navigated washboard roads in the high desert that would destroy a normal vehicle. I know what normal looks like in remote locations, and I know what wrong looks like. This matters because I am going to tell you about something that was very wrong, and I need you to understand that I recognized it as wrong because I had the expertise to understand what I was seeing. We arrived at our first campground on May 28th, at Payette Lake, just outside McCall, Idaho. The elevation was manageable for my wife at that point, and the campground was one we loved. Peaceful, well-maintained, quiet during the weekday periods. We set up in a waterfront site that we had specifically requested when we made the reservation 3 months earlier. The weather was perfect. The lake was calm. Margaret was feeling strong, and we spent the first 3 days taking short walks, reading on the back deck, eating meals that Margaret had researched and wanted to prepare. Everything was exactly as we had hoped it would be. On the 4th morning we broke down the RV setup and pointed north toward the Sawtooth Valley. The drive from McCall to Stanley, Idaho is approximately 80 miles and takes about 2 hours in normal conditions. The route follows Highway 55 through beautiful terrain, descending through pine forests, crossing rivers, passing through small mountain towns. For RVers it is one of the most scenic drives in the country, but it is also challenging because there are long sections without services, steep mountain grades that tax a diesel engine, and limited pullover areas if something goes wrong. I had made the drive dozens of times, and I maintained a mental map of every mechanical shop, fuel station and emergency facility along the route. I also knew the camping regulations well. The Sawtooth area is managed by the U.S. Forest Service and has very specific rules about where camping is permitted. There are established campgrounds with reservation systems and established sites. There are also dispersed camping areas where you can legally camp on federal land without reservations or facilities, but these dispersed areas have specific boundaries and are subject to seasonal closures. It is possible to camp illegally by setting up outside designated areas, but doing so risks fines and has the added danger of being completely isolated without any ranger presence or emergency resources. We stayed at 2 established campgrounds during that first phase of our trip. The first was Ponderosa State Park near McCall. The second was a private RV park in Donnelly that we used as a midpoint before heading higher into the mountains. Both were normal, well-managed facilities with the expected amenities and populations of other campers. We met people at these locations, other RVers, some families on vacation, some retired couples like us. Everything felt safe and familiar. On June 2nd we entered the Sawtooth National Forest and pointed toward Stanley, which sits at about 6,000 feet elevation in the heart of the Sawtooth Valley. Stanley is a small town of about 70 year-round residents, though that number swells during summer and fall as campers and hikers arrive. The town sits in a bowl surrounded by mountains, and from the Stanley area you can access dozens of hiking trails, fishing locations, camping facilities, and scenic viewpoints. Our plan was to base ourselves in the Stanley area for 10 days, taking day trips and short overnight trips to various locations, allowing Margaret to pace herself based on how she was feeling. We had reservation for Stanley Lake Campground, one of the most popular public campgrounds in the region. The camp sits at about 6,800 feet, surrounded by dense forest, with about 28 developed sites. I had reserved Site 14, which is a pull-through site that would not require me to maneuver the RV in tight spaces, which was important given that any emergency situation that required rapid movement would have been physically difficult for my wife. The reservation was for 6 nights, through June 8th. We arrived at the campground at approximately 2 in the afternoon on June 2nd. The day was clear, sunny, and warm. The campground was moderately busy with other campers but not crowded. Several sites were occupied by families, 1 or 2 by other RVs, and several by tent campers. The ranger station at the campground entrance was staffed, and I checked in without issue. The ranger, a woman in her late 50s whose name tag read Diane, confirmed our reservation, provided us with a map of the campground showing which facilities were operational, and gave us the standard information about bear safety, water quality, and quiet hours. Everything was utterly routine. I backed the 32-foot RV into Site 14 carefully, taking my time with the maneuver despite being experienced at parking this size vehicle. Margaret sat in the co-pilot seat, watching the passenger side clearance and calling out distance to the trees. Once I had the RV parked and level, I set up the stabilizer jacks, connected the sewer and water lines to the hookups at the site, and verified that all systems were functioning correctly. The site had full hookups, water, sewer, and 50-amp electrical power, which meant we could run the air conditioning, water heater, and all internal systems without draining our tanks or batteries. This was one of the reasons we had chosen this site rather than a primitive camping area. I needed to be able to maintain comfort for my wife without the stress of managing systems during what might be challenging days. By 3 in the afternoon we were settled. I had powered up the slide-out that extended our living space, verified that all utilities were connected and functioning, and checked that the generators could run in case we needed them. Margaret was resting in the bedroom, having tired herself slightly with the driving day. I sat on the back deck with a coffee, watching the afternoon light filter through the pine trees, listening to the ambient sounds of a moderately populated campground. Other campers were moving around, setting up sites, walking to facilities. A family with young children was playing in a nearby clearing. The ranger had mentioned that evening activities included a ranger talk at the amphitheater at 7. It seemed like a perfect location for what we had planned. That evening, Margaret felt well enough to take a short walk around the campground with me. We walked slowly, stopping frequently, paying attention to the details that had always drawn us to places like this. The way light filtered through the canopy, the sound of wind in the pine needles, the smell of forest and earth. We returned before dark, had a light dinner that Margaret had prepared ahead of time, and retired for the night. She slept well, and so did I. The next morning, June 3rd, I woke early and took a walk through the campground while Margaret was still sleeping. This was my habit, to take stock of the location, to see how other campers were behaving, to get a feel for the rhythm of the place. I walked to the ranger station and looked at the posted information about trails and facilities. I noticed something small that did not match what the ranger had told me the previous day. The campground map that Diane had given me showed the amphitheater located at the north end of the campground loop, with a ranger talk scheduled for 7 p.m. But the posted map at the ranger station showed the amphitheater at the south end, and there was no ranger talk listed for that evening. This was unusual, but not alarming. Maps could be outdated. Ranger schedules changed. I made a mental note of it and returned to the RV. By mid-morning on June 3rd, Margaret was feeling well enough to attempt a short hike. We had decided on a trail near Redfish Lake that was rated as easy and would take approximately 45 minutes round trip. I prepared water bottles, packed a basic first aid kit, and checked the weather. The forecast called for clear skies through the afternoon. We drove the RV to the Redfish Lake trailhead and parked in the designated area. The hike was beautiful and restorative. Margaret managed the trail easily, though we moved slowly and stopped frequently to rest and enjoy the views. We saw wildlife, a mule deer at a distance, various birds, a chipmunk that followed us for a portion of the trail, apparently hoping for food. We completed the hike without incident and returned to the RV by mid-afternoon. Margaret was tired but satisfied, and she rested while I performed some routine maintenance on the RV systems. When we returned to the campground that evening, something had changed. I did not notice it immediately. We pulled back into Site 14, and I parked the RV in the same position we had used previously. Everything looked normal. But when I stepped out to visually inspect the setup, I noticed that one of our stabilizer jacks had been moved. Not accidentally shifted by a slight wind, but actively repositioned from its original location. The ground around it showed footprints that were not mine, different shoe size and tread pattern. I checked with Margaret, asking if she had left the RV at any point while I was driving. She confirmed that she had remained inside, resting. I then looked at the site more carefully. The water and electrical connections were still engaged and functioning normally. The sewer line was positioned as I had left it. The back deck chairs were still set where we had left them that morning. The only thing that had been disturbed was that stabilizer jack. I walked around the RV looking for signs of damage or attempted entry. I checked the locks. Everything was secure. I did not see any evidence that anyone had tried to break in. It seemed like someone had simply walked up to the RV, moved the stabilizer jack, and left. This was unsettling, but I had a rational explanation. Campgrounds are often visited by maintenance personnel who may move equipment, adjust utilities, or perform routine inspections. Perhaps someone from the campground had needed to access the area beneath the RV for some reason and had repositioned the jack to do so. It was unusual that they had not notified me, but not impossible. I repositioned the jack to its original location and did not mention it to Margaret. She was resting comfortably, and there seemed no purpose in worrying her over what was likely an innocent explanation. That night, I slept less well than I had the previous night. I found myself listening to the ambient sounds of the campground, to the movement of other campers, to the night sounds of the forest. At approximately 2 in the morning, I heard a sound that woke me completely, the sound of something moving around the exterior of the RV. It was not the wind. It was not an animal. It was the sound of deliberate movement, of someone walking around the RV on the gravel surrounding our site. I lay in bed for perhaps 30 seconds, listening carefully, trying to determine exactly where the sound was coming from. Then it stopped. I got out of bed carefully without waking Margaret, put on a pair of shorts and a shirt, and stepped outside through the side door of the RV. I turned on the flashlight that I keep in the cockpit, and I scanned the area around the RV. The campground was quiet. The other RVs and tents in the area appeared to be dark and undisturbed. I could see the footprints in the gravel around my site. They appeared to be fresh, but I could not see anyone moving through the campground. I walked a small circuit around the RV looking for signs of damage or attempted entry. I found nothing. I stood there in the darkness for several minutes, listening, and then I returned to the RV and went back to bed. In the morning I examined the ground around the RV more carefully. There were definitely fresh footprints in the gravel, multiple sets, suggesting that someone or multiple people had been walking around our site during the night. The footprints were not regular shoe prints, but appeared to be from hiking boots with a specific tread pattern. They circled the RV but did not approach the doors or windows. It appeared that whoever had walked around our site had been doing so deliberately and with knowledge of what they were looking for. I considered reporting this to the ranger, but what would I report? No damage had been done. No property had been taken. Someone had walked around our campsite during the night. That was uncomfortable but not illegal, and I did not have proof that it was malicious. I could have been mistaken about what I heard. The footprints could have belonged to someone who had simply been taking a walk through the campground. When I thought about it rationally, there was no concrete evidence of a threat, so I made a decision that I would later recognize as a critical error. I did not report what I had observed. I did not ask questions at the ranger station. I did not take special precautions beyond the normal security measures I already employed. Instead, I rationalized the incident as coincidence and tried to return to the normal rhythm of our trip. This rationalization became increasingly difficult over the next 3 days. On June 4th, I decided to leave the campground for a day trip to explore a different area of the wilderness. We drove to a dispersed camping area near Petite Lake, about 15 miles from the main campground, to look at the landscape and potentially scout it for future camping. The area was beautiful, high elevation, surrounded by mountains, relatively few other people. We spent several hours there, had a picnic lunch, and took a short walk. We saw no one else in the area during our visit. When we returned to Site 14 at the campground that evening, I found that the stabilizer jacks had been moved again. This time not just one, but both the front and rear stabilizer jacks had been relocated. More troubling was the fact that our water connection had been disconnected from the external hookup and was lying on the ground beside the RV. There was no reason for this to happen unless someone had deliberately performed these actions. And more troubling still was what I found when I opened the RV's external storage compartment beneath the kitchen area. Items inside had been moved. Specifically our emergency supplies, a first aid kit, flashlights, and a fire extinguisher had been rearranged. At this point I was certain that someone was entering the RV during our absences, but when I checked all the doors and windows for signs of forced entry, I found nothing. No locks were broken, no windows were damaged. There were no signs of how anyone could have gotten inside without a key. This was when I made the choice to approach the ranger about what was happening. I walked to the ranger station and asked to speak with Diane, the ranger who had checked us in. I explained what I had observed: the moved jacks, the moved supplies, the footprints around the RV, and I expressed concern about whether there was a maintenance issue I should be aware of, or whether we should be concerned about our security at this location. Diane's reaction was odd. She did not seem surprised by what I was telling her. In fact, she seemed to be carefully considering how to respond. She told me that there had not been any maintenance performed on my site, and that she had not authorized anyone to access my RV. But she also said something that was strange. She said that sometimes people had unusual experiences at certain sites in the campground, and that it was usually not a serious concern. When I pressed her for specifics about what kind of unusual experiences she meant, she became vague and suggested that I might just be tired from the driving and from the stress of everything we were dealing with regarding my wife's condition. In other words, she suggested that I was imagining the problem. I did not pursue the conversation further, but her response made me realize something important. She knew what was happening. Not just that she was aware that odd incidents occurred at this campground, but specifically that she knew why someone was moving our equipment and disturbing our supplies, and she had deliberately avoided telling me about it. That night I did not sleep. I sat in the cockpit of the RV with a pair of binoculars, watching the surrounding area, and I prepared for the possibility that someone would attempt to enter the RV again. At approximately 2:30 in the morning, I observed a figure moving through the campground. The figure was wearing dark clothing and moved with deliberate purpose, not like someone taking a casual walk. I watched as the figure approached our site and then began walking around the RV, examining it carefully, moving from window to window, looking inside. I had a choice at that moment. I could have turned on the external lights and confronted the person. I could have stepped outside to demand an explanation, or I could remain hidden and observe. I chose to observe, partly out of fear of what might happen if I confronted an unknown person alone at night in an isolated campground, and partly because I wanted to understand what was happening. The figure circled the RV twice, examining every window and door. At one point the figure reached up to touch the slide-out mechanism on the side of the RV as though testing whether it was secure. Then the figure appeared to communicate with someone. I saw a hand gesture that suggested communication with another person, and then both figures walked away from the campground toward the darker areas beyond the developed campground loop. I did not follow them, but I did see enough to understand that there were at least two people involved in whatever was happening, and that they were being deliberate and coordinated in their actions. The next morning I faced a difficult decision. Margaret was tired, and she had slept well, and I did not want to frighten her by explaining what I had observed during the night. But I also could not remain at this campground knowing that we were being targeted for whatever reason. I decided that the best course of action was to inform Margaret that I had decided to change our plans, that we would move to a different camping location, and that we would base ourselves somewhere else for the remainder of our trip. Margaret did not resist this decision. She was astute enough to understand that something was wrong, and she trusted my judgment. By mid-morning on June 5th, I had broken down all connections to the hookups, powered down the slide-outs, verified that all systems were functioning properly, and prepared to leave the campground. Before I could pull out of the site, however, I noticed an older man in a ranger uniform standing near the campground loop road, apparently watching my site. When he saw that I was preparing to leave, he approached. He introduced himself as Terry Mitchell, a forest ranger with the Sawtooth National Forest. He asked if everything was okay with my site, and if there was a problem that needed to be reported. I made a decision at that moment to be honest with him. I told him that I had observed unusual activity at my campsite during the night, that someone had been moving our equipment and apparently attempting to access our RV, and that while I did not want to cause problems for the campground, I felt that this behavior was threatening enough that we needed to relocate. Terry's reaction was similar to Diane's, but more open. He did not deny that something was happening. Instead, he suggested that there might be something he should explain to us before we left. He asked if I would be willing to speak with him in the ranger station, without Margaret present initially, and he promised that he would explain what was happening at this campground. Against my better judgment, I agreed. In the ranger station, Terry explained something to me that changed the entire trajectory of our remaining trip. He told me that Stanley Lake Campground and several other established camping locations in the Sawtooth area had been experiencing a pattern of incidents over the past 2 years. Specifically, RVs and campers were being deliberately targeted by a coordinated group of people who were engaging in what Terry described as intrusive reconnaissance operations. The activity was not theft. Nothing of significant value was being taken from the RVs. It was not assault or violence. No one was being physically harmed. Instead, what was happening was that certain RVs and campsite groups were being selected, apparently at random, and their sites were being intruded upon in specific ways. Equipment moved, storage compartments opened, windows and doors examined, the campers apparently observed in their most vulnerable moments. The intrusions were designed, Terry said, to demonstrate vulnerability and surveillance capability without escalating to actual assault. I asked him why the campground had not been closed. I asked why campers were not being warned about this activity. And I asked whether this activity had been reported to law enforcement. Terry's answer was complicated. He explained that there had been informal complaints, but no campers had been willing to file official reports, mostly because nothing was being stolen and no one could prove that the intrusions were criminal rather than coincidental. Law enforcement had been made aware of the rumors of activity, but without specific evidence or reports, there was nothing they could formally investigate. As for closing the campground, Terry said that management had decided that would cause panic and potentially damage the local economy, given that camping revenue was essential to the small towns in the region. In other words, the decision had been made to accept ongoing intrusive surveillance of campers rather than acknowledge that there was a problem. I asked Terry what I should do. Should I call the police? Should I file a report? Should I leave the area entirely? Terry looked at me carefully and said something that I have thought about many times in the years since that conversation. He said, "Some places work in ways that are hard to explain to people who do not live in them. The Sawtooth area is a small region, and there are people here who operate according to rules that are not written down anywhere. If you file a police report, you might be starting something that is very difficult to stop. If you leave quietly, you protect yourself and your wife. That is probably the smartest choice." In other words, he was warning me that the intrusive surveillance was being conducted by people who had power in the local area, and that challenging them through official channels might result in escalation. I returned to the RV and prepared to drive away. I did not explain Terry's conversation to Margaret in detail, only that I thought it was best to move to a different area. We left Stanley Lake Campground at approximately 11 in the morning on June 5th. My plan was to drive to a dispersed camping area in the mountains, away from established campgrounds where there might be similar organized activity. I chose an area near Sawtooth Lake, accessible only by a rough Forest Service road, with no facilities and no established campground infrastructure. I believed that if we camped in a remote, unmarked location, away from the infrastructure and populations of established campgrounds, we would be safe from whatever was happening in those locations. This belief proved to be catastrophically wrong. The road to Sawtooth Lake is designated as Forest Service Road 37. It is approximately 18 miles long, climbs from approximately 6,800 feet elevation to nearly 9,000 feet, and is marked as suitable only for high-clearance vehicles. Our RV, while diesel-powered and equipped with decent suspension, was not technically a high-clearance vehicle, but I had driven worse roads in remote areas of the West, and the road was passable if driven carefully. The first 12 miles of the drive were manageable, though rough. The RV bounced and swayed over washboard sections and rock-strewn areas, and I had to navigate around several water-carved ruts that could have damaged the undercarriage. But by early afternoon we reached the end of the improved portion of the road, and what lay ahead was increasingly primitive. The final 6 miles of Forest Service Road 37 were barely a road at all. They were a series of eroded trails, mud-filled sections from recent rain, fallen trees, and sections where the vegetation had nearly reclaimed the path. I knew that I should have turned back at that point. I knew that we were pushing the RV beyond safe operating limits, and that if something broke down in this location, we would be in serious danger. But I also understood that Margaret did not have much time, that we had driven this far specifically to reach this remote area, and that turning back would mean returning to the established campgrounds where something organized and threatening was occurring. So I pressed forward. The RV's undercarriage scraped rocks. Branches snapped against the slide-outs and storage compartments. At one point we had to back up nearly a quarter-mile to navigate around a section of road that had eroded too severely for us to pass. By the time we reached the pull-out area near Sawtooth Lake, it was late afternoon, and Margaret was exhausted. The pull-out area was completely undeveloped. No facilities, no marked sites, just a clearing in the forest where vehicles could park. There was one other RV already parked there, an older motorhome that appeared to be unoccupied. I pulled the RV into an area that appeared level and stable, and I began the process of setting up camp. Without hookups, we would need to rely on our tank systems and generator, which meant water conservation and limited power usage. But we had everything we needed for a few nights of basic camping in a remote location. Once I had the RV secured and the generator running, I sat with Margaret on the back deck and we watched the late afternoon light fade over the mountains. The location was beautiful in a way that most established campgrounds could not achieve. Completely isolated, surrounded by forest, with no signs of human infrastructure except for the primitive road we had used to reach it and the other RV that was parked nearby. Margaret fell asleep early that evening, exhausted from the drive and the stress of the day. I sat up late in the cockpit, drinking coffee and watching the other RV through the window. I did not see any movement or lights, and eventually I convinced myself that it was either unoccupied or that the occupants had simply retired early. At approximately 2 in the morning I woke to the sound of engines starting. Multiple engines, the sound of vehicles being operated in the pull-out area. I stepped outside with a flashlight and saw something that stopped my breath. There were 4 vehicles in the clearing that had not been there when we arrived. All of them parked in a rough semicircle facing toward our RV. The vehicles were a mix of trucks and SUVs, modified for rough terrain, equipped with custom suspension and aftermarket tires. Men, I counted at least 8, were unloading equipment from these vehicles, large flashlights, coils of rope, and other equipment whose purpose I could not immediately identify. There was also deliberate coordination to their actions. They were not acting as though they were surprised to find us there. They were acting as though they had known we would be there, and they had come prepared for exactly this situation. I stepped back inside the RV and locked the door. I woke Margaret and told her, without the full context that would have terrified her, that we needed to prepare to leave immediately. I explained that some kind of group activity was happening in the clearing, and that I wanted to move the RV to a different location. Margaret, groggy and confused, asked what kind of group activity. I did not answer. I moved to the cockpit and started the diesel engine. The moment the engine turned on, the activity in the clearing stopped. The men who had been unloading equipment stopped moving and turned to face our RV. And then, moving with clear coordination, they began positioning their vehicles more deliberately, moving them to create a barrier between our RV and the direction of the primary road. I realized in that moment that we were being prevented from leaving. I put the RV in reverse and began backing away from the barrier of vehicles, moving deeper into the forest area away from the clearing. I was hoping that I might be able to navigate around their vehicles and find a secondary route back to the main Forest Service road. But the terrain away from the clearing was extremely rough, and the RV struck a significant rock formation on the undercarriage that caused a violent impact. Warning lights flashed on the dashboard, indicating potential damage to the suspension and undercarriage components. I had to stop. I shifted the RV into park and turned off the engine. Through the windshield I could see the men from the other vehicles advancing toward us. There were now more than 8 of them. I counted closer to 15, and they were moving with purpose, carrying equipment and moving in a coordinated pattern. Margaret, now fully awake and frightened, asked me what was happening. I told her to go to the bedroom and stay there, and to lock the bedroom door. She complied, though not without questions I could not adequately answer. I was faced with a series of choices, none of them good. I could attempt to restart the engine and try to navigate away through the forest, which would likely result in further damage to the RV and potential injury if we struck obstacles or overturned. I could stay in the RV and hope that these people did not attempt forced entry, or I could step out and attempt to communicate and understand what was happening. I chose to attempt communication. I opened the RV's door and stepped out, keeping my hands visible. I called out to ask what they wanted, and why they had positioned their vehicles to prevent us from leaving. A man who appeared to be in his 50s, with a weathered face and wearing a ranger uniform similar to the one Terry Mitchell had worn, approached. He introduced himself as Garrett Hayes and said he was with the Forest Service. He explained that our RV had entered an area that was under active management for wildlife protection, and that civilian vehicles were not permitted in this area during the current season. He said that they needed to help us turn the RV around and guide us back to the proper campgrounds. His explanation was obviously false. There was no wildlife management operation happening in this clearing. The men he was working with were not Forest Service personnel. They were wearing mixed civilian clothing with no consistent uniforms or official identification, and the coordination with which they had arrived and positioned their vehicles suggested that this was a planned operation. I asked Garrett specifically to explain why they had positioned their vehicles to prevent us from leaving before I even attempted to leave. Garrett's response was to smile, and then to explain that the RV was actually stuck, that the damage we had incurred when we hit the rock had disabled the vehicle, and that we were not actually capable of leaving even if we wanted to. He said that they were there to help, and that we should allow them to assess the damage and see if they could assist. What happened over the next several hours established a pattern that would persist through the remainder of our time at that location. The men from the group worked on our RV, opening compartments, examining systems, checking the undercarriage, while repeatedly asking questions about our food supplies, water capacity, our communication systems, and whether we had notified anyone of our planned location. I understood, with increasing clarity, that we had been deliberately guided to this location. The intrusive reconnaissance at Stanley Lake Campground, the subtle threat in Terry Mitchell's warning, the seeming coincidence of finding the rough Forest Service road in the remote pullout area, all of it had been coordinated to bring us to this specific place, isolated from help, dependent on our vehicle's systems, and with no one knowing where we were. I realized I needed to find a way to communicate to the outside world that we were in danger. Our cell phones had no signal this far into the mountains. Our RV had a CB radio, but I had no way of knowing if anyone would be monitoring it, or if transmissions could be traced back to our location. I had a roadside emergency beacon that I kept in the RV for situations like this, a personal locator beacon that, when activated, would send a distress signal to the National Search and Rescue System through satellites. But I could not activate that beacon without these men noticing, and I did not want to trigger an escalation before Margaret and I had a chance to escape or before help could potentially arrive. The men worked on the RV for hours, and eventually they informed me that there was significant damage to the suspension that would require parts we did not have and professional equipment to repair. They suggested that I could drive the RV slowly back to the main highway, but that I should not attempt to drive it at normal speeds. This was technically true. We had damage that would require professional repair. But it also meant that if I attempted to drive away from this location, I would be moving slowly and would likely be followed or intercepted. By late morning on June 6, the men had withdrawn to their own vehicles but had not left the area. They posted personnel who remained visible, making it clear that they were watching the RV and monitoring whether we attempted to leave. Margaret remained locked in the bedroom, frightened and confused. I needed to think. Over the next 16 hours I formulated a plan. The RV was damaged but functional. The warning lights indicated suspension damage and possible hydraulic system problems, but the engine ran and the transmission appeared to be functioning. If I could get the RV to the main highway and, more importantly, to a populated area, I could alert law enforcement to what had happened. The problem was that any attempt to leave would likely trigger a confrontation with the men who were watching us. At approximately 3 in the morning on June 7th, I decided to act. I woke Margaret and explained, without full detail, that we needed to leave immediately and that there was potential danger if we did not move quickly. I told her to get dressed and to bring only essential documents, her medical records, identification, our insurance information. I explained that we would abandon most of our possessions if necessary, but that we needed to leave the location as quickly as possible. Margaret, still sick and still frightened, complied. I performed a rapid shutdown of the RV systems, ensuring that we could restart if we needed to. but prioritizing speed over thoroughness. At approximately 3:25 in the morning, I started the diesel engine and turned on the headlights. The men watching the RV responded immediately, but there was confusion in their response. They had not expected us to attempt departure in the middle of the night. I put the RV in drive and began accelerating toward the primary Forest Service road, abandoning any pretense of careful driving and accepting the damage that the rough road would cause. Behind us I saw lights as the other vehicles attempted to follow, but the road's condition and the superior knowledge I had of navigation meant that our RV, despite its damage, could move faster than they could coordinate. I did not follow the main Forest Service road that we had used to arrive. Instead, I attempted a more direct route through rougher terrain, knowing that the high-suspension RV could navigate terrain that lower vehicles could not. I drove for approximately 40 minutes, navigating by headlights and memory of the map I had studied, expecting at any moment to be intercepted or forced to stop by other vehicles. But as I pushed the damaged RV down progressively better maintained roads, the lights behind us gradually faded, and I understood that we had created sufficient distance and confusion that the coordinated group had lost our trail. By dawn we had reached the main highway. By noon we were in Boise. By evening we had reported the incident to the Idaho State Police and to the Boise Police Department. Our experience was documented, officially reported, and investigated. What emerged from that investigation was simultaneously clarifying and disturbing. The group that had detained us and coordinated the intrusive activities at Stanley Lake Campground was not a criminal enterprise in any traditional sense. It was a coordinated network of local residents, including several people with official positions within the Forest Service and local government, who had organized what they called wilderness security operations. Specifically, they targeted RVs and campers whom they believed did not belong in the Sawtooth area, and they engaged in intrusive surveillance and intimidation designed to convince these campers to leave. The group did not have any formal name or documented membership. It was more of an informal network, coordinated through personal relationships and local connections. Their stated purpose was to protect the wilderness character of the region by discouraging camping by outsiders. Their actual purpose, as law enforcement eventually determined, was to establish control over a region of federal land by making normal recreational use so uncomfortable and threatening that only local people felt safe camping there. The police investigation determined that at least 34 separate incidents of intrusive surveillance and intimidation had been reported over a 2-year period. The group had targeted RVs and tent campers, moved their equipment, entered their vehicles, and in at least one documented case, followed a family to their destination after they left the campground. In no case had there been actual physical violence, but in every case the effect had been psychological intimidation and a clear message that the victims were not welcome. Federal charges were eventually filed against 8 individuals, including Garrett Hayes and Terry Mitchell. Local charges were filed against 4 others. The charges included trespassing, theft, stalking, and conspiracy. Some of the accused were convicted, others reached plea agreements, and several, due to legal technicalities or community resistance to prosecution, were either not charged or had their charges dismissed. The campground that we had stayed at was not closed, though it was placed under closer federal monitoring. The Forest Service made public statements about rededication to protecting the safety of recreational campers, and life in the Sawtooth region gradually returned to what passed for normal. But there were consequences that extended beyond the legal proceedings. Margaret and I did not take another extended camping trip. She remained my wife for another 5 months, until her death in late November of that year. The experience of being detained and threatened in a remote location, of understanding that people in positions of authority were part of a coordinated intimidation network, had affected her deeply in those final months. She did not speak much about it, but she had become fearful in ways that she had not been before, and I believe that the stress of the experience contributed to the accelerating decline in her physical condition. I have not returned to the Sawtooth Wilderness since June of that year. I have not attempted to contact any of the group members to understand their motivations more deeply. I have not attempted to process the experience through formal counseling, though my therapist has suggested it would be beneficial. Instead, I have simply accepted that there are places in this country where normal rules do not apply, where people with local power can create systems of informal control, and where being in the wrong place at the wrong time can expose you to dangers that no camping preparation can adequately address. I still own the RV. It has been repaired and restored to functional condition, but I only use it now to travel to populated areas with established infrastructure and clear law enforcement presence. I no longer camp in remote locations. I no longer attempt to access federal land in areas where I am not intimately familiar with the local dynamics and the local people, and I do not recommend that you visit the Sawtooth Wilderness for RV camping, or for any camping at all unless you know the area and the people who control access to it. There are beautiful places in this country that are controlled by informal networks whose purpose is not hospitality or welcome but rather territorial control and the exclusion of outsiders. You cannot identify these places from official campground listings or from tourism materials. You can only learn about them by talking to other people who have experienced them, and by being willing to hear warnings about places that sound beautiful but are actually dangerous in ways that have nothing to do with weather or wildlife. There were other incidents that occurred during our time at that campground and in the months after, details that would require more context than is appropriate for this account. The longer case files and additional documentation are available to channel members who want to understand the full scope of what coordinated community exclusion can look like when it operates without oversight or accountability. Margaret's death in November of that year changed my relationship to this experience. I no longer view it primarily as something that happened to us, but rather as something that happened to her in the final months of her life. A violation of the peaceful final experiences that she deserved and that I had hoped to give her. I have made my peace with it as much as anyone can, but I have not forgotten what I learned about how informal power operates in remote areas, or about how quickly official systems can fail when they are compromised by people with local influence. If you are an RV camper, subscribe to this channel and share this with anyone you know who camps regularly in remote areas. And if you ever encounter people or situations in a wilderness campground that feel coordinated or threatening, trust that instinct. Do not stay. Do not rationalize. Do not assume that official uniforms or authority guarantees safety. Some places work in ways that outsiders cannot easily understand, and the smartest response is to remove yourself from those places as quickly as possible. We were lucky. We escaped. We reported the incident. Convictions were eventually obtained. But luck and official process are not the same as safety, and knowing that you survived something does not mean that someone else will survive the same experience. I still drive past the turnoff to the Sawtooth Wilderness sometimes, when I am traveling through Idaho for other reasons, and I still, without fail, do not turn the RV in that direction. There are places that you should not go. Not because they are dangerous in conventional ways. I stopped watching for ships about 2 years ago. I still climb the stairs every morning at 5:30, same as I have for the past 8 seasons, but I do not look at the water anymore. I look at the sky. I check the radio frequencies. I maintain the logs. I exist in that tower the way a machine operates, performing functions without observation, without curiosity, without ever allowing my eyes to settle on the surface of the lake for longer than a navigation report requires. This started in the summer of my 5th season there, a week into June, when the water was still cold enough to stop your heart, and the fog rolls in thick enough that you cannot see the breakwater from the tower's top level. Before that summer, I loved the job. Before that summer, I had not yet learned what Lake Superior was actually showing me. My name is David Reeves, and for the past 8 years I have been the primary observer and report coordinator for the Superior Basin Monitoring Station. If you know anything about the Great Lakes, you probably know Superior is the deepest and coldest, the one that does not release its dead. What you might not know is that there are still 6 active lookout towers positioned along the southern and western shores, staffed by people like me, people whose job is to watch the water and report anything that looks like distress. We are not dramatic. We do not exist in your emergency scenarios. We are the first filter. We are the reason a captain knows whether to call for backup at all. And we are the only people who see everything that moves on that water, day and night in any weather, without interpretation or second-hand report. I want to be clear about something before I continue. Everything I am going to tell you is documented. I mean that in the sense that I recorded observations in official logs. I mean that in the sense that other people saw what I saw, though they have different explanations for it. I mean that there are reports filed in formats that do not circulate publicly because there is no public narrative that fits them. And I mean that I am alive, and I am speaking to you now, and the tower is still there, though it has not had a regular observer since I left. If you spend your time on stories like this, if you find yourself drawn to inexplicable things that happen in places where people should be paying attention, then stay with me. Share this with someone who thinks they would have handled that summer better than I did. Like this video, subscribe, and let me know where you are listening from, because I need to know that people in normal places with normal views and normal lighting are hearing this. I need to know that I am not the only one anymore. The Superior Basin Monitoring Station exists because of a succession of incidents in the 1970s and 80s, vessels disappearing, distress calls that went nowhere, a shipping forecast that was accurate but came too late. The government response, as it often does, was to establish observation infrastructure. The towers are official, the logs are official, the protocols are official. What is not official, what has never been official, is the reason my tower was the only one that required a permanent resident observer instead of a twice-weekly rotating visit. I did not know that when I applied. My hiring briefing mentioned the isolation, the weather, the responsibility, the salary. It did not mention that my predecessor had left under circumstances that the regional manager described as mutually agreeable but whose eyes suggested something else. It did not mention that the tower had been equipped with a reinforced communication system designed for redundancy, that there were backup frequencies most monitoring stations did not have, or that the equipment had been maintained at a cost that seemed disproportionate to the tower's official status. I learned those things gradually, through inventory, through casual conversations with the maintenance technician who visited quarterly, and through reading the previous logs, which I had every right to do. The previous observer, her name was Catherine, had kept detailed notes. Not just the mandatory shipping reports, but personal observations. She wrote about the weather in a way that suggested she was tracking patterns. She recorded times of unusual animal behavior. She noted the water's color and temperature in entries that went beyond protocol. Her handwriting in the final months of her tenure became smaller and more careful, as though she was trying to fit more information into less space, or as though her hands were shaking when she wrote. Her last entry was dated March 15th, a Wednesday, and it said only, "The pattern returns to Tuesday, nothing leaves, everything returns. I request reassignment effective immediately." 2 weeks later I arrived. I am not a dramatic person. I was not chosen for this job because I had mystical sensibilities or because I felt called to something greater. I was 42 years old, divorced, and I had spent the previous decade working as a port observer in Duluth, standing on docks, watching shipping containers get loaded and unloaded, keeping tabs on tonnage and safety violations. I was competent at that job. I was also lonely at that job, and I was tired of seeing the same people every day. When I saw the posting for a resident tower observer, an actual position offering isolation and technical work in weather systems and marine observation, I applied without much hope. The interview was brief. They asked about my Coast Guard training, which I had. They asked about my experience with radio equipment, weather reporting, and basic meteorology. I had all of that. They asked if I was comfortable with long periods alone, I said yes, and I meant it. They asked if there was anything that would make me unable to complete a contract. I said no, and I meant that too, though I was not answering the right question. I was assigned to the Superior Basin Monitoring Station, Tower 6, effective April 1st. The tower is located on a limestone peninsula that extends into Superior about 4 miles from the town of Ashland, Wisconsin. The peninsula itself is narrow, heavily forested, and accessible only by a maintained gravel access road that the Forest Service grooms twice a month. The tower sits at the peninsula's tip, 180 feet tall, painted red and white, equipped with the most complete observation platform any of the 6 stations maintains. It has a fully enclosed cab on top, climate control, backup generator, water system, and sleeping quarters in the base that are comfortable enough that I could genuinely live there without returning to the mainland for weeks at a time. The base of the tower is surrounded by about 30 acres of cleared land, not cleared in the natural sense, but cleared in the managed sense, with regular mowing, sight lines maintained, and a gravel perimeter that makes vehicle approach obvious and unambiguous. Beyond the cleared area, the forest reasserts itself, old-growth white pine and northern hardwood, thick enough that you cannot navigate without a blazed trail. The nearest house is 3 miles away. Ashland is 5 miles by road. Help, if you needed it in a genuine emergency, was approximately 20 minutes away in good weather. I moved in on a Thursday. The previous observer had left everything in place: furniture, kitchen supplies, clothing, personal effects. The regional manager explained that Catherine had departed hastily, that they would be in touch about collecting her belongings, and that I should not disturb her equipment or files unless necessary for my duties. I spent that first evening reading the last 6 months of logs in detail, trying to understand what kind of observer Catherine had been, and what she might have been trying to communicate through those shrinking notes. By May I had established a routine that I maintain largely unchanged to this day. I wake at 5:30. I perform a visual sweep of the water from the tower base, noting visible traffic, weather patterns, and anomalies. I climb to the observation cab and perform a more detailed assessment, including radio check-ins with the other 5 towers, weather services, and the Coast Guard station in Bayfield. I log all findings in the official daily report. I perform equipment maintenance checks, monitor the backup systems, ensure the generator is fueling properly, and verify radio frequencies are clear. I eat. I perform light exercise to maintain function in the isolated environment, and I spend my evenings reading, listening to radio, or working on personal projects that do not require much attention. By June I had not yet seen anything that required reporting beyond routine traffic and a minor engine fire on a commercial fishing vessel that we vectored toward support without issue. The first wrong thing I noticed did not seem wrong at the time. It was a pattern in the maritime traffic, a subtle rhythmic quality to the movement of shipping through the area that I might not have noticed if I had not spent most of my waking hours staring at the water. Lake Superior traffic is generally predictable. Larger vessels follow marked shipping lanes. Fishing vessels operate in the shallow water closest to shore. The occasional private boat appears, usually in the afternoons when recreational traffic increases. The pattern is stable enough that you can predict a route within minutes after seeing a vessel's origin point. In the second week of June, I became aware that I could predict routes more accurately than I should have been able to. A bulk carrier would appear, heading west. I would track it for 10 minutes on binoculars, note its approximate speed and bearing, and enter the prediction into the log. 10 minutes after entry, it would be exactly where I predicted it would be. Not approximately. Exactly. The same was true for fishing vessels, for smaller transport boats, for anything that moved on the water. I was predicting position within 50 feet on vessels I could barely see. I rationalized this by assuming I was simply getting better at the job. I had been doing it for 6 weeks. I had reviewed the previous observer's logs. I understood the water's behavior, the current patterns, the seasonal movement of fish populations that drew commercial vessels. The accuracy was just competence, I told myself, the kind of skill that develops when you spend enough time watching the same dynamic system. I entered my observations correctly. I did not note anything unusual. The second anomaly was more difficult to dismiss. In the third week of June, I noticed that a specific commercial fishing vessel, the Margaret Arlene, registration number I recorded carefully, had been passing my observation point at precisely 6:43 every morning for 8 consecutive days, not approximately 6:43, exactly, down to the minute. The captain, if it was the same captain, adjusted for weather, tide and wind in such a way that the vessel arrived at the same exact time every day. On the 9th day the Margaret Arlene did not appear. I contacted the Bayfield Coast Guard station and reported the pattern break as a possible distress situation. They checked their traffic monitoring network and confirmed that the Margaret Arlene's last recorded position had been placed on their system at 6:43 the morning of the 8-day streak's end. They had received no distress call. They had no record of the vessel entering port anywhere in the region. They suggested that the captain might have altered his route and recommended I continue monitoring for re-emergence on the traffic network. I should have left it at that. I should have logged the vessel as missing and moved forward. What I did instead was review the previous observers' logs for any mention of the Margaret Arlene. Catherine had mentioned it. The Margaret Arlene appeared consistently in her notes beginning in February of her tenure, and ending abruptly on a date that Catherine had circled with a pen, March 12th. 3 days before Catherine requested reassignment. Catherine had not listed the Margaret Arlene as missing. She had written beside the date a single note, Tuesday again. I spent 2 hours that evening reading every entry Catherine had written that mentioned a vessel, a time, or a pattern. I found 17 instances where Catherine had circled a date or written a time in capital letters. I found dozens of entries where she had noted that something had repeated, mirrored, returned, or reset. I found an entry from March 9th where she had written, "They know I am counting," and I found the final entry again, where she said the pattern returns to Tuesday and nothing leaves and everything returns. The anomalies I experienced were not random, they were not coincidence, and they were not the normal variation of maritime traffic. They were repetitions. They were patterns that showed evidence of intentionality. And I was reasonably certain on the evening of June 22nd that I was seeing exactly what Catherine had seen in February and March, the thing that had frightened her enough to abandon her job. I want to be direct about the fact that I did not make the right decision here. A trained observer, a competent person, someone whose job it is to report anomalies to proper authorities, should have contacted the regional manager that night. I should have provided the full context, the vessel appearing at precisely the same time, its sudden disappearance, the previous observer's notes about repetition and patterns. I should have requested a replacement observer or at least a consultation with someone who understood what the previous observer had experienced. I did not do that. I logged my suspicions in a personal notebook, not in the official record. I decided to observe more carefully. I decided to keep watching. I have spent a lot of time understanding why I made that choice. Partly it was the assumption that if there was something genuinely wrong, the regional manager already knew. Catherine had been here. Catherine had left hastily. The tower had been equipped with redundant systems and permanent staffing before Catherine's tenure. If the situation was genuinely dangerous or unknown, surely I would have been briefed. Surely the government does not send an isolated observer into a situation where the previous observer had documented fear. Partly it was professional pride. I had been handling the job well. I had not struggled with the isolation or the responsibility. To report this, to admit that I was seeing patterns that I could not explain, felt like admitting that I was not competent enough for the position. And partly I think it was pure curiosity. I wanted to know what Catherine had seen. I wanted to understand the pattern, so I watched. I began keeping a separate detailed log, recording not just the official information but the precise times, the exact positions, the patterns I could identify and how vessels moved through the region. I created charts. I compared notes with weather records and tide tables. I looked for the mechanism that could explain this accuracy, this repetition. There had to be a cause. There had to be something I was missing. By the beginning of July I had filled 2 full notebooks, and I had begun to see the shape of something massive underneath the surface detail. The vessels that appeared during daylight hours followed routes with small variations, but variations nonetheless. Courses shifted slightly based on weather and conditions. The Margaret Arlene, for instance, normally traveled within a corridor about half a mile wide, adjusting slightly based on wind and current. But there were other vessels that moved with no variation at all. A small transport boat, the Duluth 4, appeared at exactly 7:32 every evening, traveling on an absolutely constant bearing, never deviating, never adjusting for conditions. It appeared 47 times in June, 47 times at exactly the same time, traveling the exact same route. I was wondering about these things one evening in early July when my radio crackled with a call from the Bayfield station. A commercial fishing vessel, the Sea Meridian, had issued a brief distress call at approximately 10:15 in the evening. The captain reported engine failure and was requesting a tow toward harbor. The position he provided placed him roughly 6 miles west of my tower, well within my observation range. I should have been able to see him. The night was clear. The moon was 3/4 full. I could see for at least 10 miles in any direction. There was no vessel at the position the Sea Meridian's captain had provided. I told the Coast Guard this. They asked me to expand my search, to look north and south of the reported position, to see if the captain might have misidentified his location. I searched. I found nothing. The Bayfield station vectored 2 rescue vessels toward the last known position and began attempting radio contact with the Sea Meridian. The captain did not respond. I maintained observation through the night. The rescue vessels arrived at the position, performed a thorough grid search, found nothing, and eventually returned to station. By dawn, the Sea Meridian had been logged as missing. The Coast Guard initiated a broader search, which continued for 3 days and turned up no evidence of the vessel, no debris, no bodies, no sign that the Sea Meridian had ever existed in the location where the captain said it was. The thing that kept me from sleeping through that night, and many nights after it, was this. I reviewed my evening logs. At approximately 8:45, just under an hour and a half before the Sea Meridian's distress call, a vessel I had been tracking began to deviate from its normal route. It was the Duluth 4, the one with the absolutely constant routine. The Duluth 4, which appeared every evening at exactly 7:32, changed course for the first time in 47 recorded appearances. It moved southeast, toward deep water, away from the shipping lanes and away from the normal navigation corridor. 7 minutes later, the Duluth 4's position indicator vanished from the water entirely. There was no light, no radio signal, no trace of any vessel at that location. 8 minutes after that, the Sea Meridian issued its distress call from a location where I could see nothing. I recorded these observations in my personal notebook. I did not report them to the Coast Guard or the regional manager. I was beginning to understand that what Catherine had meant by nothing leaves and everything returns was not poetic, it was literal. Vessels were not leaving, or rather they were leaving, but they were leaving the water. They were ceasing to exist in the observable world. The Coast Guard documented the Sea Meridian as a casualty. The official report suggested hull failure, possible distress call prior to catastrophic event, loss of all hands. There was a memorial service. The crew's families received the corresponding notifications and support. Life continued. I continued watching. I continued recording. In July, I documented 5 additional vessels that deviated from their normal routes and then vanished. In August, the number increased to 8. Each time I saw the pattern before it occurred. A subtle shift in trajectory, a deviation from the established bearing, and then nothing. Each time, I reported the deviations to the official channels, claiming that I was tracking an anomaly in traffic patterns that might suggest navigation system failures. No one seemed particularly concerned. Shipping losses happen. Lake Superior is dangerous. The phenomenon of vessels disappearing was tragic, but not unprecedented. What was unprecedented, what should have triggered greater alarm, was the pattern itself, but I had not reported the pattern. I had not mentioned the repetition, the predictability, the fact that I could see these deviations before they happened because I was watching the water so intently that I had learned its language. And Catherine had seen this too. Catherine had tried to tell someone, I assumed, and had been dismissed or ignored or convinced to leave. By late August, I was not sleeping more than a few hours a day. I was not maintaining my equipment properly. I was spending 12 hours at a stretch in the observation cab, binoculars in hand, waiting for the next vessel to break its pattern. The official logs continued to be filled accurately. I never failed in that duty. But the personal logs became frantic. I wrote about the futility of watching, the uselessness of my reporting. I wrote about the possibility that nothing I did mattered because whatever was taking these ships was selective, intentional, and far beyond my ability to prevent. I should have left. I still work in the Blue Ridge, but I do not accept night shift assignments anymore. I have been a National Park Service ranger for 27 years, and I have been offered every seasonal position, every ranger assignment, and every opportunity for advancement within my region. I have declined most of them because they would require me to be in the high country after dark, and I will not do that. My supervisor understands this, though she does not fully know why, and we do not discuss it beyond the official documentation that cites personal reasons. There are places in those mountains that should be hiked only during daylight hours, not because of weather or wildlife in any conventional sense, but because of something that becomes active when the light fails. I know this because I learned it the hard way, and I have spent the past 15 years trying to understand what I experienced and how to explain it to people in a way that does not sound like a breakdown in professional judgment. If you spend time in remote wilderness areas, subscribe to this channel and share this with someone who hikes in national parks and forests. Because I need people to understand that some warnings from rangers are not based on statistics or safety protocols, but on knowledge we accumulate through years of observation and incident reports we never quite make official. Like this video if you think outdoor warnings deserve to be taken seriously even when the reason for them is not fully explained. My name is Thomas Garrett, and I have been a ranger with the National Park Service since 1997. I started my career at Great Smoky Mountains National Park, working in search and rescue and backcountry patrol. I spent 8 years there, became certified in wilderness first aid and advanced rescue operations, and developed a genuine expertise in mountain terrain, weather systems, and wilderness safety. After Great Smoky Mountains, I transferred to Shenandoah National Park in Virginia, where I spent 12 years working as a backcountry ranger and eventually as a patrol supervisor. I have logged thousands of miles on Appalachian trails. I have managed hundreds of rescue operations. I have led training courses on wilderness safety, trail navigation, and emergency response in remote areas. I know how mountains work, how hikers think, how wilderness danger presents itself, and how to recognize when something is genuinely wrong. I tell you this because what I experienced began as something I tried to dismiss as a misunderstanding or misinterpretation of normal wilderness phenomena. But normal wilderness phenomena have explanations. They have causes rooted in weather, wildlife, terrain, or human error. What I encountered had none of those explanations, and it took me years to accept that I had witnessed something that existed outside the normal categories of outdoor danger. It started on the evening of June 23rd, approximately 15 years ago, in the remote southern section of Shenandoah National Park. I was not on an official assignment. I was on personal time, doing what I did frequently during my early years as a ranger, hiking into the backcountry in the late afternoon, planning to camp overnight at one of the established shelters, and hiking back out the following morning. This was completely routine for me. I had hiked these trails hundreds of times. I was confident in my navigation, my equipment, and my ability to handle any situation that might arise. The trail I chose was the Black Rock Ridge Trail, a moderate route that climbs from the valley floor into the higher elevation ridgeline. The trail is approximately 5 miles one way, mostly well-maintained, with established campsites and water sources. The weather forecast called for clear skies and temperatures in the mid-50s. I left the trailhead at approximately 4:30 in the afternoon, expecting to reach the shelter before dark and to have comfortable sleeping conditions overnight. I moved deliberately on the trail, not rushing. I was in no hurry. The light would remain good until at least 8 in the evening, and the shelter was easily accessible in 4 hours of hiking. I was carrying a full pack with camping equipment, water, food, and emergency supplies. I was well prepared. The hike was uneventful through the first 2 miles. I made good time, enjoying the forest around me, noticing the wildlife signs and the seasonal plant activity. The forest was in full early summer condition, everything green, the understory thick with growth, birdsong frequent and clear. I passed several day hikers coming down from higher elevations, and we exchanged the usual courtesies. Everything was completely normal. At approximately 6 o'clock, with the light beginning to shift toward evening, I reached the area where the Black Rock Ridge Trail intersects with a secondary route, the Crest Trail, which runs along the ridgeline and connects to several other major trails. This junction is a common waypoint, and I stopped there briefly to check my position and verify that the trail ahead remained clear. While I was resting at the junction, I noticed something that was subtle enough that I almost dismissed it. The bird calls in the forest around me had changed. Not completely, there were still birds calling in the distance, but in the immediate vicinity of the trail junction, the bird activity had decreased. The forest around me was quieter than it had been just minutes before. The ambient sound of the forest had shifted. This is not an unusual phenomenon. Birds can change their behavior based on light, predators, or other factors. But I noticed it, and I made a mental note of it because as a ranger you develop habits of observation. You pay attention to small changes in the environment because sometimes small changes indicate larger changes. I resumed hiking after a few minutes, and I pressed upward toward the shelter. The trail became steeper, the elevation gained more pronounced, and the forest around me gradually shifted from mixed hardwood to more evergreen heavy growth. The light was beginning to fade noticeably. The sky above the canopy was still bright, but the forest floor was increasingly shaded, and I made a decision to increase my pace to ensure I reached the shelter before full darkness fell. At approximately 7:30, still with good light but with the sun approaching the western ridgeline, I reached the Black Rock Ridge Shelter. The shelter is a 3-sided structure, built by the Park Service decades ago, with a raised floor, a roof, and open front facing downslope toward the valley. It is equipped with a bear-proof food locker and a water source approximately 50 yards away. I had stayed at this shelter dozens of times, and I had always found it to be a reliable, comfortable camp location. I set up my camp quickly and efficiently. I hung my food in the bear locker, arranged my sleeping bag and padding on the shelter floor, and collected water from the nearby spring. By 8 o'clock I had completed my camp setup and had prepared a light dinner. The light outside the shelter was failing, but it was not yet complete darkness. I could still see clearly into the forest surrounding the shelter, though the distant tree line was becoming indistinct. I sat at the front of the shelter, eating and watching the forest transition from day to night. This is something I have always enjoyed about backcountry camping, watching the shift from daylight to darkness, observing how the forest changes as the light fades, noticing the changes in animal activity and sound as nocturnal creatures become active. But as the light continued to fade, I began to notice something that was more pronounced than the earlier shift in bird activity. The forest around the shelter was becoming quiet in a way that was unusual. Not just the absence of birdsong, that was normal as night fell, but a kind of deeper silence. The insects that had been creating ambient background noise throughout the afternoon were quieting. Even the sound of wind moving through the canopy seemed to fade. By 9 o'clock, when I had finished eating and had extinguished my small cooking fire, the forest had become almost unnaturally quiet. This was unusual enough that I checked my equipment and my position to ensure I was in a safe location, and that nothing in my surroundings suggested immediate danger. Everything appeared normal. I was at a maintained shelter, my food was secure, my water source was available, and my camp was set up properly. There was no objective reason to be concerned, but I decided, partly out of caution and partly out of what I can only describe as instinct, not to wander far from the shelter. I had planned to walk a short distance down the trail to a viewpoint to look at the stars before going to sleep, but I decided against it. I remained at the shelter. I went to sleep around 10 o'clock, lying in my sleeping bag inside the shelter, listening to the forest around me. At some point during the night, I estimate around 2 or 3 in the morning, though I was not checking the time, I woke suddenly. I was alert, completely awake, without the gradual transition that usually accompanies waking from deep sleep. My heart was elevated. My body was in a heightened state of alertness. I did not move. I simply lay in my sleeping bag and listened to the forest around me. What I heard was the sound of something moving through the forest. Not distant movement, but movement that was relatively close to the shelter, perhaps 50 to 100 yards away. The movement was deliberate and paced. Something was walking through the forest with purpose, making no particular effort to move quietly but also not crashing through the undergrowth loudly. It was a regular, steady movement through the trees. I have spent enough time in wilderness to recognize the movement patterns of different animals. Deer move with a particular rhythm and tend to make light sounds as they walk. Bears are heavier and create more substantial sounds. Smaller animals create more chaotic movement patterns. This movement did not match any of those patterns precisely. It was steady, bipedal, and moving along what appeared to be a deliberate course. At the time, my assumption was that this was another hiker who had arrived at the shelter late or who was hiking the trail at night for some reason. This is possible, though uncommon. Hikers do sometimes hike at night, either for practical reasons or because they are navigating in darkness toward a shelter. So my first rationalization for what I was hearing was that another person was in the vicinity. The movement continued for several minutes, and I listened carefully to try to determine whether the person was approaching the shelter or simply passing through the area. The movement seemed to be circling the shelter, passing close to it but not approaching directly. The sound moved from one side of the shelter to another, maintaining a roughly consistent distance. Then, after perhaps 5 minutes of this circling movement, the sound stopped. The forest became quiet again. I waited for the movement to resume, but it did not. Whatever or whoever had been moving through the forest had stopped. I did not sleep for the remainder of the night. I lay in my sleeping bag, alert and listening, until the first light of dawn began to brighten the eastern sky. Throughout the remainder of the night I heard no further sounds from the forest. The silence remained complete and undisturbed. As soon as the light had improved enough to see clearly, I packed up my camp, deciding that I would not remain at the shelter any longer. I organized my equipment quickly, secured my food locker, and prepared to hike back down the trail. I did not want to stay at the shelter into the daylight hours. I wanted to return to the valley and the trailhead as quickly as possible. As I was packing, I noticed something that caused me concern. Around the shelter, particularly on the side that faced upslope into the forest, there were footprints. Not human footprints, but tracks pressed into the soft ground and the moss that covered the soil around the shelter. The tracks appeared to be from a large animal, something with a significant weight pressing into the earth. I examined the tracks more carefully, trying to determine what animal might have made them. The prints were approximately hand-sized, too large for a raccoon or fox, too defined for a deer's hoofprint, The pattern suggested a walking gait, with the prints arranged in roughly linear progression, suggesting a deliberate pace. The tracks appeared to go completely around the shelter, pressed into the ground multiple times, as though the animal had circled the shelter repeatedly during the night. I do not know what animal made those prints. The size and configuration did not match anything I was familiar with from my ranger experience. I did not dwell on this analysis at the time. I simply noted it, photographed it in my mind, and decided to leave the shelter immediately. I started hiking down the trail at 6:30 in the morning, with the sun not yet fully above the eastern horizon. The trail was clear and I made good time. I was moving faster than I normally would on a descent, in part because I was motivated to get down the mountain quickly, and in part because I wanted to ensure I reached the trailhead before conditions changed or before anything else unusual occurred. As I hiked down the trail, I was thinking about the tracks around the shelter and trying to construct rational explanations for what I had heard and what I had seen. The most likely explanation seemed to be that a black bear had been investigating the shelter during the night, drawn perhaps by some residual food smell or simply out of curiosity. Black bears do investigate campsites at night, and they are capable of creating prints of the size and shape that I had observed. This explanation made sense, and I was comfortable accepting it as the most probable cause of what I had experienced. I reached the trailhead at approximately 10:30 in the morning. I stopped at the ranger station to report my overnight trip and to mention that I had seen tracks at the shelter that appeared to be from a bear. The ranger on duty, a younger woman named Sarah Mitchell who had recently started working in the park, seemed mildly interested but not concerned. She asked if I had seen the bear itself or if it had damaged anything, and when I answered no to both questions, she simply logged it as a wildlife sighting and thanked me for the report. I went home and did not think too much about the experience for the next week. Approximately 10 days later, I was assigned to a nighttime patrol in the backcountry. This was a routine assignment, part of my normal job responsibilities. The purpose of the patrol was to respond to a report that some hikers had been spotted camping in an unauthorized area, and I was tasked with locating them and issuing a warning citation if necessary. The patrol would take place in the late evening and overnight, and I would return to the ranger station the following morning. I accepted the assignment without hesitation, though I realize now that I should have requested to reschedule based on my recent experience at Black Rock Ridge. At the time, I did not think my previous night in the field had any relevance to this new assignment. They were in different areas of the park and the circumstances were completely different. I approached the assignment as I would have approached any routine patrol. The area where the unauthorized campers had been reported was approximately 8 miles from the trailhead, in a remote section of the park with minimal established infrastructure and no formal shelters. I would need to locate the campers by following the trail into their approximate location, identify them, issue a citation, and remain in the field overnight before returning the following day. I left the ranger station at 5 in the evening with a full pack containing camping equipment, citation forms, and communication equipment. Another ranger, a man named David Chen, who had about 5 years of experience, was originally scheduled to accompany me, but he called in sick that day, and I was told to proceed with the patrol solo. I felt comfortable doing this. A solo backcountry patrol was not unusual for me, and the assignment did not seem to present any particular danger. The hike to the area where the campers had been reported was uneventful. I moved along the trail, checking my position regularly, and at approximately 7:30, as full darkness was settling over the forest, I arrived at the general area where the illegal camp had been reported. I found the camp quickly. It consisted of 2 tents, a fire ring, and various camp equipment scattered around a small clearing just off the trail. The campers were present, a young couple who seemed genuinely surprised to encounter a ranger at that location during the evening. I explained the violation, issued a citation, and explained that they would need to either relocate to an authorized campsite or leave the park. The couple complied without resistance, and they began packing their camp. I stayed at the location while they organized their equipment, preparing to hike them back to the trailhead, or at least to ensure they left the area. This process took approximately 30 minutes. During the time I was waiting for the campers to pack, I was observing the forest around the clearing. Just as I had noticed at Black Rock Ridge, I noticed a shift in the ambient sound of the forest. The bird activity that had been present as darkness fell began to decrease and then essentially cease. The insect sounds that had been creating background noise faded. The forest became noticeably quieter. The couple who were packing their camp did not seem to notice this change, or if they did not comment on it. They finished packing and began preparing to hike out. I told them I would accompany them part of the way to ensure they reached the main trail safely. We hiked for perhaps a quarter mile down the trail, moving back toward the trailhead, when the couple asked if they could stop for a brief rest. I agreed, and we stood on the trail for perhaps 3 minutes, catching our breath. During that rest, I heard something in the forest to our right, something moving at some distance from the trail. The sound was similar to what I had heard at Black Rock Ridge, a deliberate, steady movement through the forest, something of significant size moving with purpose. The couple also heard it, and they became noticeably nervous. They asked what the sound was, and I told them it was probably a deer or possibly a bear, and that they should not be concerned. We resumed hiking, moving more quickly than before. We reached the main trail junction, and I informed the couple that they should have clear trail from that point back to the trailhead. They thanked me and proceeded quickly down the trail in the direction of the trailhead. I did not accompany them further. I then turned around and hiked back toward the unauthorized camp area, planning to spend the night in that location as originally scheduled. I needed to document the site and ensure the campers had actually left the area, and I was assigned to remain in the field overnight to verify that no other groups attempted to camp illegally in that location. By the time I reached the camp clearing again, full darkness had settled completely. The moon had not yet risen, and the sky was overcast, blocking out any starlight. The darkness was substantial, and I was relying on my flashlight to navigate. I set up a basic camp at the edge of the clearing, away from where the unauthorized campers had been, and I prepared for the night. Unlike at Black Rock Ridge, I had not anticipated sleeping at this location, so I had minimal camping equipment. I had a light sleeping bag and a ground pad, but I did not have a shelter. I set up my equipment in a location I felt was defensible and secure, and I prepared to remain alert throughout the night. I was not expecting to sleep. The experience at Black Rock Ridge, combined with what I had heard while the couple was packing their camp, had created a significant level of unease in me. I was alert and watchful, and I was approaching the night more as a surveillance operation than as rest time. At approximately 11 o'clock, with the moon having risen enough to provide some ambient light, I began to hear the same kind of movement in the forest that I had heard at Black Rock Ridge. This time the movement was more pronounced and more frequent. There were sounds coming from multiple directions, as though whatever was creating the sounds was not just circling from one location but was moving through the forest from various points around the clearing where I had set up my camp. I want to be precise about what I heard. The movement was steady and deliberate. It did not sound panicked or distressed. It sounded purposeful and coordinated. Multiple sources of sound suggested that there were multiple entities moving through the forest, perhaps moving as a group, or at least in coordination with one another. I remained still in my camp, not moving, listening carefully. The movement continued intermittently for perhaps 20 minutes. Then, gradually the sounds faded. The forest became quiet again, and no further movement sounds were heard for the remainder of the night. I did not sleep. I remained alert and watchful until dawn, and as soon as the light improved sufficiently to navigate safely, I packed my minimal camp and hiked out of the area. I did not wait to document the unauthorized campsite, and I did not spend the additional time that had been allocated for the patrol. I simply left the area and returned to the ranger station. When I arrived at the station, I reported that the unauthorized campers had left the area and that I had issued the required citation. I did not mention the sounds I had heard or my observations about the forest becoming unnaturally quiet. I simply filed the standard report and completed the assignment. Over the following weeks, I began to notice a pattern in the ranger reports that came across my desk. Reports that I paid attention to because I had become hyper-aware of anything that might be relevant to what I had experienced. There were several reports of hikers on late afternoon or evening hikes who reported hearing unusual sounds in the forest during the hours after sunset. There were reports of groups that had attempted overnight hikes and had abandoned their trips, descending the mountain during the night to return to the trailhead, sometimes without clear explanation for why they had decided to leave. There was one report from another ranger describing tracks around a backcountry shelter that matched the description of the tracks I had seen at Black Rock Ridge, large prints of indeterminate origin, appearing to circle the shelter multiple times. And there was, most significantly, a report of an overnight hiker who had not returned from a planned overnight trip. The hiker was missing for 36 hours before a search was organized. When found, he was alive but was in a state of severe psychological distress. He reported that he had heard sounds in the forest during the night, had become frightened, and had abandoned his shelter and hiking gear to hike down the mountain in complete darkness in what he described as an attempt to escape something that he could not adequately describe. This report, combined with my own experiences, created a pattern that I could no longer dismiss as coincidence. Something was happening in the backcountry during nighttime hours that was not consistent with normal wildlife behavior or normal hazards that a ranger would typically encounter. I made a decision to investigate this systematically. I began requesting access to historical ranger logs going back several years, reviewing reports of unusual incidents, missing persons cases and wildlife sightings that occurred during nighttime hours or that involved hikers who had experienced distress during evening hours. What I found was a pattern of incidents that suggested something had been occurring in the Appalachian backcountry for at least the past decade. There were cases of hikers who had abandoned equipment and hiked out at night in apparent panic. There were reports of unusual tracks and animal activity that did not match any known species. There were several cases of hikers who had started out on planned overnight trips and had not returned, with search operations ultimately locating them many miles from where they should have been, often delirious or incoherent about what had happened to them. None of the incidents, taken individually, seemed to point conclusively to a single explanation. But taken together, they suggested a consistent pattern. Hikers who remained in the backcountry after dark experienced distress, heard unusual sounds, and were motivated to leave their planned routes and return to the trailhead as quickly as possible. I reviewed all of these reports carefully, taking notes and attempting to construct a pattern that might explain what was happening. I did not discuss my investigation with any of my colleagues, partly because I was unsure how to explain what I was investigating, and partly because I was becoming aware that discussing these findings might result in my credibility being questioned. I came to understand, through my analysis of the historical reports, that there appeared to be a consistent warning or instruction embedded in the institutional knowledge of the park rangers, though it was not formally documented or explicitly communicated. Rangers who had worked in the park for extended periods seemed to avoid scheduling backcountry assignments during nighttime hours. They seemed to discourage hikers from planning overnight trips. They seemed to avoid hiking in remote areas after dark. When I began to consciously observe this pattern in the behavior of other rangers, I realized that I was not the first person to have identified this unspoken rule. Other rangers, through their own experiences or through observation, had come to understand that the Appalachian backcountry contained something that became active after dark, and they had organized their work and their recommendations to hikers in a way that minimized exposure to whatever that was. I decided to approach one of the more senior rangers, a man named Jack Morrison, who had worked in the park for over 30 years and who had never, to my knowledge, accepted a nighttime backcountry assignment. I asked to speak with him privately, and I explained that I had been researching historical incidents in the park, and had noticed a pattern that suggested something unusual was occurring in the back country during nighttime hours. Jack was quiet for a long moment after I explained my observations. Then he said something that I have reflected on many times since. He said, "You do not want to know what is happening out there at night. The best thing you can do is organize your work and your life in a way that keeps you out of the back country after dark. Tell people it is for safety reasons, tell them it is park policy, tell them whatever you need to tell them, but do not go into the back country after dark, and do not encourage other people to do so." I asked him specifically what was occurring at night that warranted this warning. He said, "I have spent 30 years in this park and I have heard sounds that I cannot explain and have seen evidence of activity that I cannot rationalize. I have read reports from rangers who experienced far worse than I have, rangers who encountered things in the darkness that changed them permanently. But I have not gone looking for answers, and I have not attempted to document or investigate what is happening. I have simply organized my life to stay away from the backcountry after dark, and I have recommended that everyone else do the same. That has worked for me, and it will work for you if you are smart enough to accept the advice." I pressed him for specifics, asking what he had personally experienced or what specific incidents he was referring to. He declined to provide details, saying only that he had made a decision years ago not to discuss what he had witnessed because discussing it did not change the situation and only affected his ability to function professionally in the park. He concluded the conversation by saying, "The back country belongs to us during the day. At night it belongs to something else. Stay out of it after dark and you will be fine." I spent the following months wrestling with what Jack had told me and what I had learned from my research. I had experienced something on Black Rock Ridge and during my patrol assignment that did not fit into conventional explanations. I had found evidence that a pattern existed within ranger logs and incident reports. I had discovered that other experienced rangers had come to the same conclusion about avoiding the backcountry after dark, but I did not have concrete evidence. I did not have photographs or samples or anything that I could point to and say definitively this proves something unusual is happening. I had experiences, patterns, and the testimony of other rangers who were unwilling to discuss what they knew. By the standards of scientific evidence or law enforcement investigation, I had very little. I made a decision that I think was necessary for my own mental health and professional integrity. I accepted that something was occurring in the Appalachian backcountry during nighttime hours that I could not fully explain or document. I accepted that this something was dangerous enough that experienced rangers had organized their entire careers around avoiding it. And I decided that the rational response was to do the same. I requested a change in my work schedule. I made a formal request to my supervisor that I not be assigned to backcountry assignments during nighttime hours. I cited safety concerns and personal circumstances, and I did not provide detailed explanation. My supervisor approved the request, and my schedule was adjusted accordingly. Since that time, over the past 15 years, I have structured my work in the park to remain in areas with established infrastructure and regular traffic during daylight hours. I have accepted daytime ranger assignments, guided tours, trail maintenance work, and administrative duties. I have not declined any assignment that would keep me in the backcountry during daylight hours. I have simply made myself unavailable for nighttime work. I have explained that I made a personal decision based on family obligations and work-life balance, and I have not elaborated beyond that. Most rangers accept this explanation without further questions, particularly as they have likely made similar decisions themselves. But I want to be clear about something. I have never discovered what is in the backcountry after dark. I have never seen it clearly. I have heard sounds that I cannot explain. I have observed tracks that do not match any known animal. And I have experienced a consistent pattern of distress that occurs when hikers remain in the backcountry during nighttime hours. But I have never directly encountered whatever is creating these phenomena. The longer case files and specific incident reports that I have reviewed through my access as a ranger remain in the park system and are not publicly available. Some of these files contain detailed accounts from hikers and rangers who experienced more direct encounters with whatever is in the backcountry after dark. Encounters that resulted in psychological trauma, physical injuries, or in some cases permanent missing persons. If you want access to these case files and additional documentation about the pattern of incidents and what rangers have come to understand about the nature of the disturbance, that information is available to channel members who want to go deeper into this investigation. I have worked in the Shenandoah region for a decade and a half since my experiences at Black Rock Ridge, and I have come to understand that the Appalachian Mountains, in their vast and remote areas, contain something that emerges after dark. I do not know the nature of this thing. I do not know whether it is a single entity or multiple entities. I do not know whether it is animal, human, or something else entirely. I do not know whether it is actively hunting or whether it is responding to perceived threats. What I know is that it creates sounds that are consistent and patterned. It moves through the forest with purpose and coordination. It has the ability to induce such fear in humans that experienced outdoor people will abandon their equipment and hike through darkness to escape it. And it has been present in the backcountry for at least the past couple of decades and possibly much longer. I know that experienced rangers avoid the backcountry after dark, and they do so based on knowledge that is not formally documented but is passed from ranger to ranger through indirect communication and observation. And I know that if you value your safety and your sanity, you do not hike in the Appalachian backcountry after dark. Not because of bears or weather or any conventional danger, but because there is something else there, something that belongs to that space during those hours, and confronting it is not worth the risk. The final thing I want to communicate is something that happened approximately 6 months ago. I was working a daytime trail maintenance assignment in a remote section of the park when I came across something in the middle of the trail. It was a piece of camping equipment, a hiking boot actually, that bore a name tag inside the sole. The name belonged to a hiker who had gone missing 3 years earlier while on an overnight trip. The search for him had been extensive and ultimately unsuccessful. The boot was in an area that search teams would have covered multiple times and should have located. I do not know how that boot came to be on the trail in the middle of the daytime, in an area that had been thoroughly searched. I do not know whether it had been there for the past 3 years undiscovered, or whether it had been placed there more recently. I photographed it, reported it to my supervisor, and watched as it was documented and placed into evidence for what remained of the missing persons investigation. But what I thought, and what I have continued to think about since then, is that something in the back country at night had kept that hiker's boot for 3 years. Something had preserved it, held onto it, and then allowed it to be found in the middle of the day on a highly traveled trail. I do not know what that means. I do not know whether it was a message or a warning or simply a coincidence that had nothing to do with what I have experienced. But I know that it changed my understanding of what is happening in those mountains at night, and it reinforced my decision never to return to the back country after dark. Hike the Appalachian trails during daylight hours. Enjoy them while the sun is up, respect them. But do not stay after dark, and do not ignore warnings from rangers or other experienced hikers who seem reluctant to provide detailed explanation for why they believe the nighttime hours are dangerous. The absence of a detailed explanation is not a reason to dismiss the warning. It may actually be evidence that the threat is real enough that people who have experienced it do not want to discuss it or relive it through detailed explanation. The night belongs to something else in those mountains, and the smartest thing you can do is let it have the night undisturbed.